She dropped her lunch tray, and the whole cafeteria burst into laughter. Seconds later, a millionaire in a light blue suit walked in, and everything changed. The cafeteria at Maplewood Elementary was buzzing with the usual lunchtime chaos, the sound of trays clattering, sneakers squeaking on the linoleum floor, and dozens of voices rising and falling in bursts of conversation. Lily Miller, a small 6-year-old with long blonde hair that always seemed to catch the light, moved carefully through the crowd, clutching her lunch tray. She wore her neatly pressed white blouse and blue skirt, the outfit her mother had ironed the night before, hoping Lily might feel confident today. She didn't. Not really. Ever since the whispers started in class about her mom working as the school's cleaner, it felt like a shadow followed her everywhere. Some kids made jokes under their breath, others were bolder, smirking or tossing out comments about mops and buckets as she walked by. Lily had learned to keep her head down and move quickly, but today she hesitated at the long table by the window, looking for a seat. Her hands were small and the tray was heavier than she expected. One step too quick, one sneaker catching on a chair leg, and it happened, the whole lunch shifted forward. The cup of soup tipped, spilling in a golden arc across the floor. The metal spoon clanged and spun in a dizzy circle before rolling away. The sound was loud enough to cut through the cafeteria noise, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. Then the laughter started. It wasn't the gentle kind that comes from surprise or shared amusement. It was sharp, the kind that finds a target and presses down. A boy at the next table slapped his palm on the table and leaned back, grinning at his friends. Someone in the corner made an exaggerated imitation of a clumsy stumble. Lily's cheeks burned hot, and the heat climbed to her ears. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, the sting of humiliation sharp and instant. For a moment she thought about running, but her feet stayed rooted. The soup was already soaking into her skirt where it had splashed, the smell of chicken broth mixing with the faint detergent scent from her blouse. She bent down to reach for the spoon, her fingers trembling, but the sound of the laughter only grew. In that moment, she felt smaller than she'd ever felt before, as if the whole cafeteria had turned into a stage and she was the punchline of a joke she had never agreed to tell. She was still crouched on the floor, her hand hovering just above the fallen spoon, when the air in the cafeteria seemed to shift. The noise of the laughter softened in pockets, replaced by the sound of a door opening at the far end of the room and the low, confident rhythm of footsteps crossing the linoleum. People turned their heads one by one, as if an invisible thread were pulling their attention toward the man who had just walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an ease that suggested he was used to being noticed. His hair was dark and neatly cut, his blue eyes sharp yet calm, and the light blue suit he wore seemed almost too bright against the dull cream walls of the school. Most visitors to the cafeteria were parents dropping off forgotten lunches or delivery men bringing supplies. This man was clearly neither. There was something deliberate in the way he moved, no hesitation, no uncertainty, as though every step had already been decided before he took it. A few teachers at one of the nearby tables exchanged quick glances, recognizing him instantly. Ethan Blake, the CEO of Blake Tech, the tech company whose name had been in the local news all week for partnering with Maplewood Elementary. He had been scheduled to meet with the principal later that afternoon, but here he was now, stepping directly into the middle of a small, cruel drama without pausing to ask permission. Lily barely had time to register who he was before he stopped in front of her. She was frozen in place, her fingers still half extended toward the spoon. Without a word, he bent down, not hurriedly, but with a quiet deliberation, and picked it up. His hands were steady, his movements unhurried, as though this moment was more important than any meeting waiting for him. He set the spoon back on the tray, then reached for a handful of napkins from a nearby table and held them out to her. His voice, when he spoke, was low enough that it was meant only for her, yet clear enough for those closest to hear. "It's all right," he said. "Happened to me once too." The corners of his mouth lifted slightly, not in amusement at her misfortune, but in a way that told her he understood exactly how she felt. The kindness in his tone was so unexpected, so steady, that for a second the burning heat in her cheeks eased. Around them, the laughter had stopped, replaced by a strange, almost awkward quiet. Children who had been smirking a moment earlier were suddenly focused on their food. The boy who had slapped the table earlier now stared at the soup on his own tray, as if it had become the most interesting thing in the world. Ethan straightened, extending his hand slightly toward Lily as though inviting her to take the next step. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the exit. "Let's get you cleaned up." She hesitated, unsure whether to move or to shrink back, but the calm in his voice made it feel safe. When she stood, her skirt clinging damply to her legs, she felt every eye in the room on her, but not in the same way as before. There was no longer the same cutting edge to their stares. It was as if the presence of this man in his immaculate suit had shifted the balance of the room, removing the audience from the cruel little play she had been trapped in. She didn't know who he really was yet, or why he had chosen to step in, but for the first time since the tray had fallen, she felt like she wasn't alone in the middle of it. The hallway outside the cafeteria was quieter, the hum of conversation replaced by the faint echo of footsteps and the distant clang of lockers. Ethan walked a few steps ahead, holding the cafeteria door open for Lily before guiding her toward the nearest sink in the staff restroom. The fluorescent light hummed softly overhead, casting a pale glow on the tiled walls. He turned on the tap, letting the water run until it was warm, and pulled a roll of paper towels from the dispenser. Lily stood beside him, her small hands twisting together, unsure of what to say or where to look. The sharp scent of the cafeteria's cleaning solution lingered in the air, oddly familiar to her. She kept her eyes on the floor, but her voice came out in a whisper so faint it almost disappeared in the sound of the running water. "They laugh at me because my mom's a cleaner." The words hung there between them like something fragile but too heavy to hold back. She expected him to brush it aside or offer some quick, polite reassurance, the kind that adults give when they don't really know what else to say. Instead, Ethan turned slightly toward her, resting one hand on the counter for balance, his reflection visible in the mirror above the sink. He didn't speak right away. His gaze flicked briefly to his own reflection, and for a moment his expression softened, as if the memory of something long ago had just risen to the surface. "You want to know a secret," he said finally, his tone quieter now but steady, as if he meant every word. "My mom was a cleaner too. In this country. In a school not much different from yours. She worked nights so I could go to class during the day. I used to sit in the corner while she finished mopping floors, hoping no one from my school would see me." Lily's head lifted just enough to meet his eyes. There was no trace of pity in his face, only a calm certainty that made her feel less exposed. He rinsed one of the paper towels under the warm water, then gently handed it to her. "You see," he continued, "the only people who laugh at that are the ones who don't understand how much strength it takes. Keeping a place clean isn't something to be ashamed of. It's the kind of work that holds everything else together, even when no one notices." She dabbed at the soup stains on her skirt, the warmth from the wet paper towel seeping into her hands. It wasn't that his words made the hurt disappear, but something shifted inside her, loosening the knot that had been sitting in her chest since the moment the tray hit the floor. He stepped aside to give her more room, folding his own paper towel into a neat square before tossing it into the bin. When she had finished, he opened the door for her again, his hand resting lightly against the frame. "Come on," he said, his voice carrying that same unhurried steadiness. "Let's go back in there. You don't hide because of them. If anything, they should be the ones wondering if they're good enough to sit with you." For the first time all day, Lily felt a flicker of something that almost resembled courage. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it was there, a small ember catching in her chest as she stepped back toward the noise of the cafeteria, this time with Ethan walking beside her. Sarah Miller was kneeling in the far end of the hallway, her rubber gloves glistening under the dim light as she wrung out the mop head and pushed it back into the bucket. The water had already taken on a cloudy gray tint, the inevitable result of cleaning the morning's traffic from hundreds of sneakers. She moved with the steady, practiced rhythm of someone who had done this countless times, each sweep of the mop deliberate, the sound of the wet fibers sliding across the tile almost hypnotic. Her dark blonde hair was tied back in a loose bun, a few strands falling free to frame a face that carried both weariness and quiet pride. This was her job, her way of keeping a roof over her daughter's head, and though she never expected praise for it, she hadn't expected the day to bring anything unusual either. From around the corner came the muffled voices of Principal Hudson and Miss Rogers, Lily's teacher. Their footsteps slowed as they approached, the polite, measured tone in their conversation suggesting they had been talking about something they didn't want overheard. Hudson, tall and square-shouldered, offered Sarah a practiced smile, the kind reserved for school events and parent conferences. Miss Rogers mirrored it, her hands clasped together in front of her. "We just wanted to thank you for all you do," the principal said, the words floating in the air with the hollow weight of a formality. Sarah paused, straightened slightly, and nodded, though she could feel there was something unspoken hanging between them. It was the way Miss Rogers avoided meeting her eyes for more than a second at a time, the way Hudson's smile never quite reached his. At the other end of the hallway, near the doors to the gym, two parents stood in conversation, their voices carrying just far enough for fragments of their words to reach Sarah. One of them, a woman in an expensive camel coat and sharp heels, tilted her head toward the cafeteria with a smirk. "What's this little performance about?" she said to the man beside her. "The millionaire must be bored if he's playing hero in a school lunchroom." The man chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Guess he needs some good PR, helping a cleaner's kid is an easy headline." The words slid into Sarah's ears like cold water, and for a moment her hands froze on the mop handle. She had been ignored often enough to be invisible, but there was something worse in being seen only to be dismissed, her worth reduced to a joke whispered between people who thought she wouldn't hear. What none of them realized was that Ethan Blake had been walking just a few steps behind. He had taken the longer hallway back from the cafeteria, and as he rounded the corner, the last sentence from the man's mouth caught his attention. He didn't break stride. His expression didn't harden into open anger, but his eyes sharpened, and when he spoke, his voice carried enough calm authority to make both parents look up immediately. "If watching respect bores you," he said evenly, his gaze shifting from one to the other, "you might want to find a different seat tomorrow. Because boredom isn't what's coming." There was no threat in his tone, no raised volume, just the kind of certainty that made his words land with a quiet weight. The woman in the camel coat blinked, caught off guard, and opened her mouth as if to defend herself, but Ethan had already turned his attention toward Sarah. His posture softened slightly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a brief, reassuring smile, as if to say he'd heard more than enough to know what mattered. Sarah wasn't used to strangers stepping into moments like this, most people pretended not to hear, or worse, joined in. But Ethan's presence didn't feel like pity, it felt like someone placing a steady hand against a door she had been holding shut for far too long. Hudson cleared his throat, glancing between Ethan and the parents, suddenly aware of the shift in atmosphere. "Mr. Blake, we were just on our way to," he began, but Ethan cut him off gently, his tone still calm. "And now you're on your way to think about what kind of school you want this to be." He didn't say more, didn't need to. The silence that followed was thick enough to press into the walls, broken only by the soft swish of Sarah's mop as she dipped it back into the bucket, more to have something to do with her hands than because the floor needed it. As Ethan walked away toward the administrative offices, Sarah found herself watching his back, not because he was a millionaire in a perfect suit, but because he was the first person in a long time who had treated her role in this school as something worth defending out loud. The echo of his words lingered in her mind long after the hallway grew quiet again, and though she couldn't have guessed it yet, the next day would prove him right, it would not be boring. The next morning, the entire school gathered in the gymnasium for the weekly assembly, though this one felt different before it even began. The bleachers were packed with restless students shifting in their seats, the squeak of sneakers and the creak of wooden boards echoing in the high-ceilinged space. Teachers stood along the walls in loose clusters, murmuring to one another in low voices. A few parents had arrived as well, either by invitation or curiosity, their eyes scanning the stage at the far end of the room where the podium stood waiting. A large school banner hung behind it, the deep blue fabric swaying gently each time the heating system kicked on. When Principal Hudson stepped up to the microphone, the low hum of the crowd quieted just enough to be manageable, though stray whispers still floated up from the students in the back rows. "Good morning, Maplewood," he began, his voice amplified and slightly tinny through the speakers. "Today we have a special guest who has come to speak to us about an exciting new chapter for our school." He glanced toward the right side of the stage where Ethan Blake was waiting, hands clasped loosely in front of him, his light blue suit catching the overhead light in a way that made him stand out from everyone else in the room. Hudson offered a small, almost cautious smile as he continued, "Please welcome Mr. Ethan Blake, CEO of Blake Tech." The applause that followed was scattered at first, a polite smattering from the adults and a few enthusiastic claps from the younger students who didn't entirely understand why they were excited. As Ethan walked to the podium, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. His presence seemed to draw focus without him having to demand it. He placed his hands lightly on either side of the podium and looked out over the crowd, scanning the faces until his gaze seemed to settle briefly on Lily, who sat in the third row next to her mother. That flicker of recognition was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a steady, calm confidence. "I didn't come here today just to talk about computers," he began, his voice carrying easily through the gym without the need for force. "Though yes, Blake Tech will be donating a full set of updated systems to replace your current computer lab, and I hope you'll put them to good use." A ripple of excitement moved through the students, but he lifted a hand slightly to hold their attention. "What I really came here to talk about is the people who make this school what it is. Not just your teachers and your principal, but the ones who arrive before you get here and leave long after you go home. The ones who make sure this is a place you can learn in safely, a place that's clean, warm, and ready for you every single day." Some students glanced around, following his words toward the corners of the gym where custodial staff stood quietly, clearly unused to being addressed in this way. "I'm launching a program here called First Steps," Ethan continued. "It's designed to give back to the families of the people who keep this school running, whether you notice them or not. That means scholarships for their children, free access to extracurricular activities, school uniforms, and hot lunches for those who need them. It also means recognizing the work they do in a way that lasts longer than a single thank you." He paused, letting the words settle before adding, "Part of this program will be a new contest called The Work That Holds the School Together. You'll be invited to create projects, art, essays, videos, that show appreciation for the jobs that often go unseen. The winners will be invited to spend a day at my company's headquarters, see how things are built, and learn from our team. And their parents will receive a financial award for their service to this school." The murmur that rose now was different from before, it carried genuine interest, even surprise. In the bleachers, a few students whispered excitedly to one another, already imagining what they might create. Teachers exchanged glances, some with small nods of approval, others with raised eyebrows as if uncertain whether this was too grand to be true. Near the front, Sarah sat very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She felt the heat of eyes on her and knew people were making the connection without it being said aloud. Ethan's gaze found Lily again, this time holding for just a heartbeat longer before he looked back at the rest of the audience. "Respect isn't a one-time act," he said. "It's a habit. It's the decision you make, every single day, to see the people around you not as background but as part of your world. And sometimes it takes one small moment to change the way you see someone forever." When he stepped back from the podium, the applause came louder and more sustained than before, though still mixed with pockets of quiet where people sat processing what they had heard. As the sound filled the gym, Lily reached for her mother's hand and felt it squeeze hers in return, a silent exchange of something neither of them could quite name yet. Whatever was coming next, it already felt bigger than the moment in the cafeteria, bigger than the sting of spilled soup or cruel laughter. It felt like the start of something that might actually last. The mood in the teachers' lounge that afternoon was a complicated mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and a kind of restless energy that came from too much caffeine and too many opinions in one small space. The long rectangular table in the center was cluttered with half-empty coffee mugs, crumpled paper napkins, and the remains of a tray of store-bought cookies someone had brought in that morning. A hum from the vending machine filled the background as clusters of staff members stood or leaned against the counters, talking in low but insistent voices. The topic was the same in every corner: Ethan Blake's announcement. Maddie Carter, a tall woman with a sharp bob haircut and an even sharper voice, stood near the window with her arms crossed. Her daughter was in 4th grade, and Maddie had a reputation for being one of the most outspoken members of the PTA. Next to her stood Jason Crane, a broad-shouldered man with a permanent frown and the kind of posture that made it clear he thought his opinion carried weight. They weren't whispering like the others. Their words cut across the room in a tone that was confident enough to be overheard. "Too much generosity for a cleaner," Maddie said flatly, tapping her fingers against her elbow. "What kind of message does that send to the kids? That it's fine to fail as long as someone rich swoops in to fix it?" Jason gave a short, dry laugh in agreement. "Exactly. Kids shouldn't think it's okay to fall down. Life doesn't work like that. You get up on your own, or you don't get up at all." Sarah had been standing near the coffee maker, her head slightly bowed as she stirred sugar into a paper cup she didn't really want. She wasn't part of the conversation, but their words reached her easily, each one finding its mark like it had been aimed in her direction. She felt the weight of their glances, the way they didn't need to say her name for everyone to know who they meant. The bitter smell of burnt coffee filled her nose, and she focused on the small swirl in the cup to keep from reacting. She had heard worse before, but there was something about hearing it here, in a room full of people she saw every day, that pressed harder than usual against her ribs. The door to the lounge opened, and Ethan stepped in as though he had been here 100 times before. He didn't scan the room to guess what was being said, he already knew. His gaze moved directly to Maddie and Jason, his expression calm but unyielding. "We're not teaching them to fall," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach every ear without needing to be raised. "We're teaching them to get back up, and to lift others up when they can." His eyes didn't waver, and his tone didn't harden, but there was no mistaking the steel behind the words. Yesterday's little girl didn't break the rules of propriety. She broke our habit of laughing when someone stumbles. That's a habit worth losing. For a moment, the only sound was the vending machine's hum and the faint clink of a spoon against a mug from the far side of the room. Maddie's lips pressed into a thin line, and Jason shifted his weight as if he might say something else, but the momentum had drained from their argument. Ethan moved toward the table, setting a sleek black laptop down with quiet precision. "Since we're talking about what's fair," he continued, "I stayed up last night making sure that this program wasn't just an idea. The grant money has already been transferred to the school. The insurance coverage for every custodial and support staff member has been filed and approved. This isn't a promise, it's done." He turned the screen toward the principal and a few nearby teachers, showing the signed documents and confirmation emails, each one with the school's name in bold across the top. "If anyone thinks this is just for show," he added, "I suggest you take a look at the numbers and see for yourself." His voice remained even, but the weight of his certainty settled heavily in the room. Sarah hadn't moved from her spot by the coffee maker, but something in her chest eased as she watched the exchange. It wasn't just that he was defending her, it was that he was dismantling the argument piece by piece, leaving no room for doubt or dismissal. In a place where she had learned to keep her head down, someone else had decided her dignity was worth raising up into the light. Ethan closed the laptop with a quiet click, picked it up, and glanced around the room one final time. "We can choose to make this school a place where respect is visible," he said, "or a place where it hides in the corner. I've already made my choice." Without waiting for a reply, he left the lounge, the door swinging shut behind him, leaving a silence that felt heavier than anything that had been said aloud. Sarah stood there for a long moment, her coffee cooling in her hand, wondering when the last time had been that someone's words made her feel taller instead of smaller. The contest had been announced only a week earlier, but for Lily and her mother it had quickly become the center of their evenings. After Sarah finished her shift, They would sit together at the small kitchen table in their apartment, its surface crowded with markers, scraps of colored paper, and the occasional coffee mug pushed aside to make room for their project. The idea had come from Lily herself, a poster they would call "Invisible Hands Are Always Seen." She wanted it to show not just her mother's work, but the feeling behind it, the quiet way she moved through the school before the students arrived, the care in her motions even when no one was watching. Sarah had been hesitant at first, worried that putting herself in the center of attention might bring the wrong kind of focus, but Lily's determination softened her resistance. The poster began with a photograph they had taken in the living room, Lily's small hand resting inside her mother's larger one, both slightly worn from the day but steady. Around it, Lily drew images she thought represented her mother's job: a bucket, a mop, rows of desks with a shining polish on them. Sarah added a few details, sketching the outline of the school hallways in pencil, and together they colored them in. They wrote the words in large, bold letters across the top, the marker strokes uneven in places where Lily's hand had trembled slightly but her focus never wavered. On the day of the presentations, the gymnasium had been transformed into a gallery of projects. Posters lined the walls, and tables displayed models, essays, and videos playing on small laptops borrowed from the computer lab. Parents stood with their children, pointing out their work, while judges from the school board and community made their way slowly from one display to another. Sarah and Lily stood in front of their poster, waiting their turn, the hum of conversation surrounding them like a low tide. Lily's fingers twisted in the hem of her shirt, her nerves clear, but when her name was called she stepped forward with surprising steadiness. She began softly, her voice hesitant at first, but as she spoke about her mother's early mornings and late evenings, about how she came home tired yet still found time to help with homework, her words gained weight. She explained how the school looked ready each day because someone had cared enough to make it that way, and how that someone was her mother. The gym was quiet as she spoke, and though her voice trembled once or twice, she never stopped. Among the crowd sat Maddie Carter, the same parent whose words in the lounge had carried so much sting just days before. Her daughter Emily sat beside her, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees, her eyes fixed on Lily. As Lily finished and stepped back, Emily turned to her mother and whispered, just loud enough for Sarah to catch, "Mom, who would clean if she didn't?" Maddie's posture shifted, her shoulders dipping slightly as she looked down, the first crack in the certainty she had worn so tightly before. When the presentations ended and the judges moved on, Maddie approached Sarah with an expression that was almost unfamiliar on her face, hesitant, almost humbled. "I wanted to say. I was wrong," she admitted quietly, her voice lacking its usual edge. "I didn't see it the way I should have." Sarah nodded, not because the words erased what had been said before, but because they mattered all the same. Emily stepped forward then, holding a folded piece of paper. She placed it carefully at the bottom of the poster, where Lily's drawings framed the photograph of their hands. "Thank you, Miss Sarah," the note read in uneven handwriting. "I'll help wipe the desks today." For Sarah, it was a small gesture, but one that carried more weight than most people in that gym could understand. For Lily, it was proof that her voice had been heard, that the work she had chosen to honor truly meant something to someone else now. The poster stood there, simple and handmade, but it had already done more than they could have hoped. It had started to change the way people looked at the hands that held the school together. A month later, the school looked and felt different in ways that went beyond the new computers sitting neatly in the lab. The First Steps program had moved from being an announcement to something living and active in the daily rhythm of Maplewood Elementary. The free breakfast program had started quietly at first, with a few students slipping in early to grab a tray, but soon the cafeteria was full every morning, the scent of warm food replacing the cold, empty air that used to greet them. The uniforms had arrived in tidy boxes, each one neatly folded and labeled, and parents who had been quietly worrying about how to afford them now stood with relief in their faces as their children tried them on. The extracurricular clubs were buzzing with new members: soccer, art, robotics, all suddenly open to kids who had once stayed behind because their families couldn't pay the fees. In one corner of this new energy was the First Steps Club, a small but growing group that met once a week after school in the library. It was Ethan's idea, though he had given the credit to the teachers who volunteered to help run it. The club was about more than just activities, it was about teaching kids how to ask for help and how to give it. The room was filled with mismatched chairs and a few beanbags, and on any given afternoon you could find students working together on projects, helping each other with homework, or even organizing small acts of kindness for classmates. Lily, who had once been the center of cruel laughter, now sat confidently among them, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, her laughter blending easily with the others. Emily was there too, often sitting beside her, the two of them bent over the same notebook as they planned something for the next meeting. Sarah's own life had shifted in ways she was still getting used to. The promotion to safety and hygiene coordinator had come with a real office, a key to a locked supply room, and a salary that meant she no longer had to calculate every grocery trip down to the last cent. She had a team now, 2 part-time assistants who worked under her guidance, and for the first time in years, she felt that her work was recognized not as a quiet necessity, but as a respected part of the school's structure. Parents who had once passed her in the hallway without more than a nod now stopped to chat or ask advice, and some even thanked her directly for keeping the school safe and clean. It was a change she hadn't asked for, but one she welcomed fully. The final assembly of the year brought the entire school together again in the gymnasium, the air carrying the restless excitement of students ready for summer. The stage was set much like it had been a month earlier, but this time, there was no uncertainty about who Ethan Blake was or why he was there. When he stepped forward, wearing the same light blue suit as before, the applause came quickly and without hesitation. He waited for it to fade, then began speaking in the steady, deliberate way that made it feel like every person in the room was being addressed directly. A good kind of shock, he said, is when we suddenly realize that respect is contagious. One act, one word, can start a chain reaction. And when it does, it changes not just the person receiving it, but the ones giving it, too. His gaze swept the crowd until it rested briefly on Sarah and Lily. This school has shown me that small moments, ones that might seem insignificant at the time, can be the start of something much bigger. What matters is that we notice them, and we pass them on. Then, from the small table beside him, he picked up a tiny pin, no bigger than a coin, polished so that it caught the light. He stepped down from the stage and crossed the gym floor to where Lily sat. The chatter quieted as everyone watched him kneel slightly so he was at her level. "This," he said softly, holding out the pin, "is for the person who reminded all of us how much difference one small act can make." The engraving on it read simply, "I lift up." Lily accepted it with both hands, her fingers curling around the cool metal before she pinned it carefully to her blouse. The applause that followed was warmer than any she had ever heard, not the kind that filled a space just because it was expected, but the kind that came from a place of shared understanding. In that moment, she didn't think about the day she had dropped her tray or the laughter that had once made her feel small. She thought about the hands, big and small, that had helped her since then, and the ways she could be that hand for someone else. That summer, the laughter in the halls of Maplewood didn't disappear, but it had changed. It was lighter now, friendlier, the kind that came from shared jokes and games rather than from pointing out someone's mistakes. And on the rare occasion that a tray did fall in the cafeteria, there was no pause before the sound of chairs scraping back and footsteps rushing to help. It wasn't because of a program or a millionaire in a blue suit, it was because, somewhere along the way, the people in that building had learned to see each other differently. And once you saw someone in that light, it was hard to go back to the way things were before. To me, this story isn't really about a millionaire saving a little girl, it's about the moment a community's lens shifts. One act of decency, especially when it's witnessed by many, has the power to unravel years of quiet cruelty. The cafeteria scene could have ended as just another forgettable humiliation for Lily, the kind that burrows into memory and stays there for a lifetime. Instead, it became the spark for a chain reaction that changed how people saw each other. What I find most powerful is that the ending doesn't crown Ethan as the hero, even though his actions were the catalyst. The real transformation happens in the way classmates start helping, parents begin apologizing, and Sarah's work finally receives open respect. It's a reminder that true change isn't when one person stands up, it's when everyone else starts standing with them. If anything, it leaves you wondering how many fallen trays we walk past every day, and how different the world could look if more of us decided to step in, even in the smallest way.